Let's see how we can deploy the code from a local Git repository on this machine into the Git build server in Azure App Service, so the code can be compiled in the cloud and deployed to our app service. I've already updated the home page, so we can verify that the new deployment works. First, we need to check this application code into a local Git repo. We can create one from inside Visual Studio here by going to the Git menu at the top and selecting Create Git Repository. We could create a new repository in GitHub at the same time, so we can check our code in there, but we're not going to do that in this module. We're just going to keep the code local and push it directly to Azure App Service. This default location in the repos folder is fine, so let's create the local repo. That adds the files to the repo. You can see there are little icons beside the folders now. And there are menus at the bottom to choose the branch in the repo and see how many files are checked out. Now, Visual Studio has some Git capabilities, but it doesn't provide a Git command line, and I want to show you how to upload files from outside Visual Studio in case you're using another tool like Visual Studio Code. That means we need to install Git for Windows in order to get the command line capability. You can download and install Git for Windows from gitforwindows.org. Or, since I have Visual Studio installed, we can just go to Tools, Get Tools and Features, and when that opens, go to the Individual Components tab and search for Git. Here's Git for Windows, so we're basically just going to let Visual Studio download and install this for us. I'll just agree to this dialog. And the installer is going to need to restart Visual Studio. I'll let this download, and I'll speed things up a bit here. And then the package will get installed for us. Once that happens, Visual Studio starts up again, and the project gets loaded also. So we can close this now. And let's open up a command prompt. And since we want to navigate right to the repo folder where the application code is, we can do that from the Git menu by selecting Open in Command Prompt. That puts us right in the solution folder. Let's make sure Git for Windows is installed by running a command. Okay, so we can run Git commands. We're going to connect this local repo to a remote repo, one that's in the app service, but we need to enable that first and get the remote URL. So let's go back to the Azure portal and down to Deployment Center. And let's expand the source dropdown and choose Local Git. It says this will allow us to host a simple Git server for this app on the app service plan. And this can be used to set up a continuous integration, continuous deployment pipeline. We need to save these changes in order to generate the Git repository URL. So it generated a URL that's the path to the Kudu portal with a web app name .git as the endpoint. Let's copy this to the clipboard. And now let's go back to the command line and run the Git command git remote add Azure, and then paste in the URL to the remote Git endpoint in the app service, and hit enter. There were no errors, so that's good. Now let's push the code from the local repo to the remote repo, where it will get built and deployed to the app service. We do that with git push Azure, and the branch will be the master branch. That pops up a dialog where we need to enter the deployment credentials. These are the same ones we've been using, the application scope credentials we can get from the Publish profile in Azure or from the Azure portal in the Deployment Center. Let's go back to the portal, and let's click on the tab for the local git/ftps credentials. I'll copy the username and paste it into the Git Credential Manager. Now let's copy the password and paste that in. And let's see what happens. It looks like it's connecting and copying the local files up to the remote Git repo. Now we're getting messages from the remote repo in Azure. It says a deployment script was generated, and the deployment command is being run, handling ASP.NET Core web application deployment with MS Build. So it's actually using Web Deploy in Azure to deploy the code from the GitHub repo. It's building the project in Azure, so Kudu is also a build server. And now it's copying the files to the www root folder of the app service. And it looks like it's completed. Let's go back to the Azure portal, and on the overview page, browse to the deployed web app. So the code was deployed successfully from the local Git repo up to the remote Git repo on our Azure App Service plan, where Kudu built the application and deployed it to the app service. We're going to be deploying a container app to Azure App Service, but before we do that, we need an ASP.NET Core project to deploy as a container. You have two options if you'd like to follow along. You can create the project in Visual Studio, or you can just use the source code in the course downloads. If you'd like to create the project in Visual Studio, you need to download and install Docker Desktop. Visual Studio requires that to create and build Docker images locally. The published features we'll look at in the next clip also use Docker Desktop functionality. Docker Desktop requires Hyper-V, or the Windows subsystem for Linux, so you'll need to install one of those as well. If you're developing on a virtual machine, like I am, that requires enabling virtualization for the guest operating system in order to install Hyper-V on the VM. I'll show you how to do that all in this clip. You also need the container development tools installed in Visual Studio, but those should be installed already when you install the ASP.NET development workload during setup of Visual Studio. If you want to skip all that and just deploy some code, you can use the source code in the course downloads. Then you'll run a command later in this module that uploads the source code and builds it in the Azure Container Registry. So if you want to continue along and build the project in Visual Studio, let's do that now. I'm running my development VM on Hyper-V. In order to install Docker Desktop on the guest VM, we'll need to install Hyper-V on the guest VM. That's called nested virtualization. To enable that on the VM, I've opened PowerShell on my host computer, so the one hosting the virtual machine, and ran this command, set VM processor, with the name of the virtual machine, and you can get a list of all the virtual machines on your computer by running the command above, get VM. Then the parameter for set VM processor is expose virtualization extensions, and set that to true. Then start up your virtual machine, which I've already done. Now we need to install Hyper-V. Press the Windows key and hit R to bring up the Run dialog box. Now type appwiz.cpl to open the Programs and Features window. Select Turn Windows Features on or off, and select Hyper-V and also Containers. Click OK and let this install. You'll need to reboot the VM when it's done installing. OK, my VM is back online. Now you're ready to install Docker Desktop for Windows. I'll open up a browser and search for it. I'll open this up, and down here under System Requirements, we've already installed the requirements for Hyper-V. We're going to be creating a Windows container to deploy. Now we're ready to download Docker Desktop for Windows. I'll speed up the download. And once it's done, I'll open up Windows File Explorer and navigate to the Downloads folder, and let's run this. It's suggesting to use WSL, but we've already configured Hyper-V, so I'll uncheck this, and let's OK this. It'll take a few minutes to install, so I'll speed this up. And once it's done, we need to log out. And I'll log back into my virtual machine. OK, now we're ready to create a project in Visual Studio that uses Docker. I'll select Create a New Project. And this again is an ASP.NET Core web app. Click Next. We'll give this a name, and on the next screen, this is where you enable Docker. And then you choose an operating system for the Docker container that the code will run on. We're going to use Windows, and let's create this app. Visual Studio will get everything ready. And now in Solution Explorer, there's a project with a Docker file to tell Docker how to build the container. Let's just make a change to the home page for this app. We'll just update this header tag, and then delete the next line. OK, we're ready to run this locally. And instead of running in the local browser, this will build the container and run it in Docker Desktop. Let's click to do that. Then a browser window opens, and the container is running from Docker Desktop. Let's close this and go back to Visual Studio. So there was a Docker file created at the root of the project, and that tells the Docker runtime which image to download and use as the base, and which image to use for the build, along with how to build and publish the code to the container. We built a container app from scratch here, but you could actually convert an existing ASP.NET Core application to a container app by right-clicking the project and selecting Add Docker Support. That'll add the nodes in the project file and create the Docker file. So we've successfully created a container app that we can deploy to a container registry to be used by Azure App Service. So let's do that next.